Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a podcast episode all about mental health awareness.
Awesome.
It's a topic that's super relevant to, well, everyone. And I think it's something that we need to be talking about more openly and honestly.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So let's jump right in, shall we? What were your initial thoughts when you first listened to the episode?
I was really struck by how the episode started off by saying, we all have mental health just like we all have physical health,
Right.
but we often treat them so differently.
Yeah.
Like, we go for annual checkups for our physical health, but when it comes to mental health, it's like there's this hesitation or stigma.
There is. There
Yeah.
totally is. I think that's a really good point. It's like we're almost afraid to talk about it.
Yeah. And the episode really digs into that whole idea of stigma.
Mhm.
Like, they talked about how people with mental health challenges are often perceived as being weak or broken.
It's true. It's like these labels that get attached to it,
Yeah.
and it makes people afraid to open up and ask for help.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the biggest problems with the stigma, right? It prevents people from seeking help when they really need it.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that contributes to this stigma is how mental health is often portrayed in the media.
Oh, for sure. The episode touched on that too.
It's like, it's always these extreme cases,
Yeah.
characters who are like unpredictable or even dangerous.
Right.
Which, of course, is not representative of everyone who's dealing with a mental health issue.
Not at all. And that just adds to the misunderstanding and fear surrounding mental health.
Exactly. And it's so important to remember that mental health struggles can manifest in so many different ways.
Oh, absolutely. That was a key point in the episode as well.
It's not always something as obvious as a panic attack.
Right. Sometimes it's just feeling off or exhausted all the time.
Yeah.
And those feelings are easy to dismiss as just stress or being tired.
Mm,
But if they persist, it's really important to pay attention to them.
definitely. And then there's social media, which I think plays a huge role in all of this.
Oh, for sure. Social media is a whole other beast, right?
It is. It can be such a double-edged sword when it comes to mental health.
Absolutely.
On one hand, it can connect people with support communities and raise awareness. But on the other hand, it can also create this pressure cooker of comparison.
Yeah, that constant comparison game. Everyone seems to be living these perfect, curated lives.
It's like we're only seeing the highlight reel, right? And it's so easy to start feeling inadequate or like we're the only ones struggling.
And the episode actually cited some studies that have shown a link between heavy social media use and increased feelings of anxiety and depression,
It makes sense.
especially among young people. The pressure to present this perfect image online can be really damaging.
Yeah, it's a lot to navigate. So given all of this, this stigma, the media portrayals, the social media pressures, what can we actually do to create a more supportive environment?
Well, the podcast had some really interesting suggestions for breaking the cycle of stigma.
Okay, great. Let's hear them.
They started with the idea of education. Like,
Yeah.
the more we understand about mental health, the more empathy and understanding we can cultivate.
Right. It's about going beyond that surface level, right? Like instead of just relying on what we see in movies or on social media, we need to actively seek out accurate information.
Exactly. Yeah, and they gave some pretty practical advice on, like, where to go
Okay.
for that deeper understanding. Like checking out mental health organizations, maybe reading books written by experts, or even watching documentaries or, listening to podcasts that share, like, real stories
Yeah.
from people who have lived experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And, another thing they really emphasized was the importance of the language we use when we talk about mental health.
Okay.
Like, even seemingly small things like saying, I'm struggling instead of I'm crazy
Mm-hmm.
can actually make a huge difference in how we frame these conversations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's about being more mindful and making sure we're not contributing to that stigma.
Exactly.
Because sometimes I think we use words or phrases without even realizing the impact they can have,
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like
Well-
telling someone to just snap out of it or think positive, like
Yeah.
that doesn't really acknowledge the complexity of what they might be going through.
No, it doesn't.
And it can actually be really dismissive.
So what about creating safe spaces for conversations about mental health? The episode talked about that too, right?
They did. And they highlighted how vital it is to foster environments where people feel comfortable sharing their experiences without fear of being judged, whether it's within families, friendships, workplaces, or even online communities.
It's like making that conscious effort to cultivate trust and understanding,
Right.
right? So that people feel safe to be vulnerable.
Absolutely. And it's not just about creating the space, but also about how we show up in those spaces.
Mm.
Like being an active listener, validating people's feelings, and offering support without trying to fix them or offer unsolicited advice.
Yeah, sometimes the best thing we can do is just listen with empathy.
I completely agree. And they also made a point that really resonated with me, which is that it doesn't always have to be this big, deep conversation.
Right.
Sometimes just a simple check-in can make a huge difference. Like genuinely asking someone, how are you really
I
doing?
love that. It's just showing that you care, that you're paying attention.
Exactly.
And another important message from the episode was that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Right, right. They talked about how reaching out to a therapist, confiding in a friend, or calling a helpline,
Hmm.
is actually a really courageous step.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that you don't have to go through it alone.
It's about self-care.
It is. It is. It's like if you had a physical health issue, you wouldn't hesitate to see a doctor, right?
Right.
So why should it be any different for mental health?
It shouldn't be. So it sounds like a big takeaway here is that breaking the stigma around mental health is a collective effort.
Yeah.
It's not just on individuals to take action, but about all of us working together to create a more understanding and supportive world.
I think that's a really important point. What
Yeah.
are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it really is. And they actually ended the episode by talking about what we can do
Okay.
on an individual level to make a difference.
Mm.
Like they really called on listeners to become advocates for mental health awareness.
So it's not enough to just listen to the episode.
No, they were like, take this understanding you've gained and actually do something with it.
Okay, so it's about turning that awareness into action.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they gave some great examples like starting conversations about mental health with your friends and family,
Mm-hmm.
sharing resources and information on social media, or maybe supporting organizations that are working to break down stigma.
Sounds like even small things can make a difference.
Totally. Like if you see someone spreading misinformation about mental health online, you can speak up and correct it. Or if
Yeah.
you hear someone using stigmatizing language, you can gently challenge them.
Mm.
It's about using our voices to make a change.
Exactly. And they emphasize that anyone can be an advocate.
Right.
It doesn't matter what your background is or if you've personally struggled with mental health.
It's about being willing to speak up and challenge those harmful stereotypes.
Yeah. Yeah. And they also reminded us that, taking care of our own mental health is super important too.
That's true.
We can't really advocate for others if we're not taking care of ourselves. Right?
That's a really good point.
It's about prioritizing self-care, seeking support when we need it, setting boundaries to protect our own well-being, all that good stuff.
Definitely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Any final thoughts before we wrap up? What stands out to you as the most important message?
For me, it's the power of connection and understanding. Breaking the stigma requires creating spaces where people feel safe to share their experiences, to seek support, and to know they're not alone.
Beautifully said. And as we've been talking, I keep thinking about how relevant all of this is to everyone listening. So I'm curious, what are you taking away from this? What resonated with you? Is there anything you might do differently based on what we've talked about today?
Those are great questions to consider. And I think the episode left us with a pretty awesome challenge, which was let's make mental health a conversation that happens more often so that everyone feels empowered to prioritize their well-being.
I love that. That's something we can all work towards. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into mental health awareness. Remember, you're not alone, and there's always hope. Until next time, take care of yourself and be kind to yourselves and to others.